Hi, welcome to AI Coffee Time with Tess Double. Please share in the chat where you're joining us from and what AI tools or approaches that you're really enjoying working with. I'm Kathy Collar. I'm the head of marketing at Tess Double. We're a pragmatic software consultancy, and we help software and product teams with everything from actionable AI to legacy modernization. We're also 100% remote, spread all over the US and Canada. And one of the ways we try to stay really intentional about connecting with each other is coffee time. We do a virtual coffee time pairing once a week. And that's where the really good stuff happens in terms of conversations about what we're working on. And so we wanted to share that with everyone else. So hence the coffee time sessions. And today with me, I have Senior Software Consultant Reilly, Senior Software Consultant Hekman, Principal Consultant David Mosher, Staff Software Consultant Reilly, and Senior Software Consultant Schneider. They're all experienced software developers and double agent consultants. We're the good kind of double agents who embed with those software engineering and product teams to help them solve the hardest problems in software. And today we're going to share some of the things we've been learning along the way. We're going to talk about AI harnesses and approaches, and that's going to include what we're building, how we are really specific with constraints and for what reasons, how if your AI harnesses are working, and again, we're going to share what we are learning. So to start, Dave Mosher wrote a blog called Quality You Can't Generate. And it argues that our leverage has shifted from writing code to designing the harnesses, the constraints, verification loops, and coded judgment that shape what AI produces. I'm going to drop a link to that blog in the chat momentarily so you can take a look at it if you haven't read it, and where you can find out more info about Test Double. But to start, for our double agent panelists, what's the one thing that you've built or adopted that you would be most reluctant to give up? We'll start with River.
Yeah. So for me, I'm pretty much only working in Claude Code these days. I haven't really had a chance to try much else. But the one thing that is really becoming load bearing and critical for me is the whole custom skills, custom agents inside of plugins. If I had to get rid of Claude today and pick up another agent harness, LLM, etc., it would need to be one that I can bring my skills along with me, because they do a tremendous amount of work for me. They help augment me as a developer so that I can get the correct results that I'm looking for, so that I can automate my processes and even have a semblance of a full team looking at whatever it is that I'm doing. That's really where the core of what I need is found, is in the skills and agents and plugins.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. At the very moment, I think it'd be interesting to zoom out just a little bit, because we're talking discreetly about a specific use of AI to agentically generate code and deal with the harnesses around code authorship. But if we think a little bit more broadly, the stuff that we're talking about here applies across like how we would use AI, for example, embedded in product. And the tools and the concepts that we're experimenting with is like a new set of primitives, a lot like Docker was a primitive that that generated things like Kubernetes and the sort of the containerized workflows that we now do at the infrastructure layer. These are primitives. These are new primitives that we're dealing with and trying to figure out how we can leverage them. And so you can imagine that you're not going to be permission smashing the button in some sort of product enabled AI thing because you don't have access to it. So what we really want to do is figure out how we can use AI predictably and consistently to make something like a pull request, which in some respects is one of the most safe things we could possibly do with AI, because it's only your developer friends that see it, or colleagues, versus launching this into a product sphere. So I think for all the folks out there that are like in the C-suite or maybe in engineering leadership, this isn't not just about like, how do we get our teams to be enabled to be better at writing agentic code, but actually how do we teach our teams to build reliable things with artificial intelligence and LLMs? And so in that scope, I think like a great skill, the thing that I would be most reticent to leave behind are these things that take some sort of core algorithmic or known central task, something like a Git command or a workflow, and we front load it with agentic generative information that knows how to take that general request and funnel it into something that this algorithmic piece can take and understand and do reliably. And then potentially on the outfill of that output is also decorated or projected with AI intent. But the course, and so that's the kind of like skill sandwich that we have, right? We have AI, repeatability, and AI on the other side. And those are the kinds of things that I'm probably most reticent to get rid of.
Nice. Skill sandwich. If that starts trending, you heard it here first. Dave.
Yeah, it's a good question because I think as I've been experimenting with these things, there's a lot of things that I've tried, but there's very few that have become a core part of my workflow. So the thing that I'd be most reluctant to give up is the structured planning and facilitation loop that you get if you have tried out Matt Pocock's Grill Me skill. It's become such a huge part of my workflow. It helps me turn a fuzzy idea into a decision tree. I get to see like dependencies that I might not have anticipated. And I think it's best for humans. And it also is really effective at producing something that an agent can concretely work from. And so for me, what makes it really valuable is it constrains both sides of my process. So as a human, it's like the antidote to blank page syndrome and unfocused discussion. It gives me a starting point. What I found is that it keeps me from disappearing into the weeds or going too broad before I've identified a real decision that needs to be made. And for an agent, if I take the output of that Grill Me skill session, it makes the agent become much better at producing a plan, which then I can deploy an agent to work on that plan and produce an implementation. Because the Grill Me skill and the whole structured planning approach, all of the important assumptions and trade-offs get bubbled right to the surface really quick and made explicit instead of becoming implicit. And the moment that I realized it was such a core part of my workflow was when I stopped using it only for myself and started using it to facilitate group conversations with teammates and clients. And at that point, it stopped feeling, oh, this is just a personal productivity trick, and started feeling like a collaboration primitive, like Jed was mentioning, these new primitives that are emerging. And so for me, Grill Me just externalizes the conversation, speeds up alignment, lets AI act as like this facilitation partner instead of just a code generator. So I would really miss that if I had to stop using it.
Nice. How about you, AJ?
Yeah, I'd be reluctant to give up, in a nutshell, customization and of the agent, and also the research, plan, and implement workflows that I think Dave was just talking about. I've used the superpower skill from Obra. It's in the Claude marketplace, as well as the research, plan, and implement from Human Layer. And like when I'm thinking about like customization, Dave linked me recently to The Bitter Lesson by Richard Sutton, which in summarized is that the bitter lesson can be read from 70 years of AI research. This is a direct quote. That is that general methods that leverage computation are ultimately the most effective and by a large margin. So what does that mean for me? I am more interested in throwing more computation at a problem than trying to hyper optimize my prompting. Prior to reading that and understanding what that blog post or essay was about, was focusing on prompting. Now I'm more interested in how can I loop the agent back into something to help me keep moving things along so I don't have to give a permission prompt or make a decision. And along those lines, hooking up auto memory and self-correcting skills. What I'd be really reluctant to give up is I have an after session hook that then goes back in a background, a Claude instance, and summarizes lessons learned or any research that happened, and it saves it in a knowledge base. So just as I continue to work, my knowledge base just builds and builds, making future sessions better. So,
Thank you. AJ and River have both been working on a lot of Claude skills. We don't have them in a public repo yet, but we are working on that. So everyone who attended the webinar will get a recording of this, and then we'll also follow up once that repo is public and we can share those skills and plugins. Rick, what would you be reluctant to give up?
Yeah, so the thing I'd be most reluctant to give up is systematic context curation, ensuring that both the human and the AI are building a shared understanding as work progresses, and that understanding improves over time, both for you and the AI, for your team, and for your system as a whole. For example, in my current engagement, the team built a context refinement pipeline where product requirements get progressively elaborated with AI-assisted architectural reviews into build and test plans. Now, it's meant to accumulate context and get smarter. But what I found by actually implementing the first part myself and understanding what it was really supposed to do was that context was actually diffusing, not accumulating. Specifications got scattered across artifacts. Some became implicit. Key domain knowledge was just missing, and nobody could tell from inside the pipeline. Every artifact just looked plausible. And I caught this because I hadn't just delegated my understanding. I'd spent time understanding the problem with the AI, then noticed I was losing comprehension as it took on more work, so I started prompting it to update my context, introduce new terms, explain decisions, what the trade-offs were, and so on. So keeping the human in the loop for comprehension, not just approval, is what made the pipeline gaps visible. And when we talk about context loss, we usually think in terms of the AI losing context. But context loss is two-sided. The AI needs context to produce good output, but the human needs good context to evaluate it. And losing that is what I'd call comprehension debt. So when I find a problem, I have the AI remember how we fixed it, what the diagnostic steps were, and so on to detect it, and make sure that the knowledge flows from session memory to local skills to shared team artifacts. So the hardness I'd be most reluctant to give up keeps both sides in sync and gets smarter every iteration.
Nice. We're going to do a quick poll, and I know like pop-up polls and webinars, this will be the only poll, I promise. So let me get this pulled up. And if you don't see a response here that matches your experience, that is A-okay. Just share in the chat. So the question is, where is your team losing the most time right now? And there's a couple options here. You can select it. Or again, if it's something else, just share in the chat. We'd love to know. So we're getting a lot of rework. Everybody's least favorite thing. Doesn't matter what tools you have, there's always rework is a horrible thing. Debugging and firefighting, though, is starting to give rework a run for its money. All right. We'll let some more people answer while I tee us up for our next question, too. We're going to talk about constraints. So let's talk about what is a constraint that you have found, you've encoded for AI that you never had to make explicit when you did the same work yourself. So we'll start with River.
So I had an answer all teed up for this. I was going to talk about writing tests and how agentic coding can produce some really brittle, essentially broken tests. It still plagues me a little bit, and I'm continuing to improve the way that I approach testing with my agent coding. But then this morning, I ran into an issue that really was shocking. Like, what just happened? My coworker on my current client project discovered a hard-coded reference to localhost in the production code. And so that got me curious, where else might this actually live inside this code base? And when I pointed Claude at the problem and told it to look, it found more than 50 locations where localhost or an equivalent was put into the production code, not just tense, not just configuration files, actual code. That to me screams exactly what you're asking about here, the constraints that we actually have to build for these agents to understand. That should never happen in production code. We should never have references. We shouldn't even have URLs in code. That should always be an environment configuration. So just this morning, I had to build a new coding standard for my client work that explicitly states no localhost references, use environment configuration for all URLs.
That's a good one. Jed?
Yeah, so I think I might take a slightly opposite tack to being very forceful about constraints and dogmatic structure. And not to say that doesn't work. I think it does. And River is doing a lot more of looping that we might get into later that might reinforce or need that reinforcement more than some of the work that I do. I find that the easiest way for me to start is to not be super explicit about the instructions, because if I am, I often tend to encode assumptions, maybe about the development cycle or what I assume or would expect another engineer to know or implicitly understand. So instead, what I do is mostly have a conversation that derives the common language, both in domain and technical acumen, and then the plan is emergent out of that conversation, so that the conversation and all the context is shared within that plan and within the context of that workflow. I think both are pretty good approaches, but I think the key thing there is to not assume that you know exactly what you're asking for up front, but make sure that you do the exploration necessary to figure out where your assumptions might bite you.
Thank you. And then AJ, you had an interesting thing to share on this.
Yes. River mentioned, I have a pet peeve with how Claude Code likes writing tests. In my opinion, it has an overuse of mocks. So I have tried all sorts of things to get to stop that behavior, adding it to my Claude MD, adding it like in the prompt, write this test, do not use mocks. And it still sneaks them in every now and then. So what I finally settled on, which has been fairly successful, is just wrote a small hook. I forget the exact trigger for it, but something like free file edit. And it looks for the diff of adding a mock. So like in Ruby on Rails, it might be like allow blank to receive such and such. And if that happens, it sends the error code 2, which halts Claude. It does not allow it to continue, and it gives my long list of instructions of how I like my tests to be written. It's like it forcefully stops the change and then gives the instructions on what it's supposed to do. So that way I don't cloud up my context window before I need it. There are plenty of times where I'm not running a test, so I don't need that in my context window at that point. So that has been successful for me. Overall, if we look at the question as a whole on constraints, I just want to plug this real quick. I have found stating goals and desired outcomes to be much more successful in getting the agent to do what I want. So giving it acceptance criteria, showing it what the end state is. That is what has been the most successful to me. And that gets into the RPI workflow, the research, plan, and implement, which very briefly, how I work through that is I first, like when I pick up a ticket, I have it verify that the ticket has clear and discrete requirements. So no unbounded things, do this thing exactly. And it walks me through, helping me through that. Then I ask it to research all the background context that it might need for it. So if I'm working with a library, pull the documentation for the library, save it to a markdown file, plan the change from what the code base is to what it needs to be. And then I clear the context. And then from that plan document that I've made, I say, go work off of this. So that way I have a nice fresh context that has everything that it needs. And it just works. That has been very successful for me.
Nice. Managing the context is great. Krupa asked a question if the links from this chat will also be shared along with the recording. We will. So all of those links to the various skills and such, we'll share those as well. Thank you for asking that. Dan, thank you for your question. We're going to save some questions for the end, but we'll start with yours. So I appreciate that. We're going to talk about harnesses and how we know they're actually working, and if there's a way to have a leading indicator on that. So River, we'll start with you.
Yeah, this is something that's been a real challenge for me, is pushing the feedback loop further and further up the timeline. And I frequently run into situations where I write a plan, I create the tickets to work on, I run through the implementation loops, and the end result is not at all what I was expecting it to be. So I'm trying to push that further backwards by making use of custom agents inside of Claude specifically. I've got a whole team of different personas now where I have a project manager, a UX designer, a security analyst, a database engineer. My favorite, though, is probably my junior engineer, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, though. But what this has allowed for me to do is really push that feedback cycle back up the timeline so that I can see in the plan documents that I'm creating where things may be slightly off. And that slightly off early in the process can cause huge ripples later on. Correcting it as early as possible has become a top priority for me lately. And I'm doing that through better skills, better agent definitions, and more manual review of everything that's being produced.
Jen?
It's a good question. So I think there's two main tasks I typically perform with AI support. One is like major code changes, what we were just talking about. And then the other one is from information gathering. I think that the feedback on both of those are slightly different in terms of understanding if things are working. For the information gathering piece, I think what I find is that if I can give it fairly general, non-specific instructions to get information, and I'm getting good information back, it tells me a lot about sort of the structure of the project that has been curated, the information that's discoverable, the skills and guardrails that are available for me to be able to go out and reach for production assets or do things. As an example, I might be in a conversation with the C-suite and they want to know something about the size distribution of buckets in the object storage, because if we scale 1000x, are we going to be penniless because of our object storage bill, sort of thing. And so being able to have those broad questions and be able to answer them gives me a good feedback that the information structure and hierarchy and discoverability is good enough to be able to have the agent know about how to find information. On the sort of implementation side of writing code, I think historically our craft is plagued by early abstraction and optimization, and likely because programming rewards this pattern recognition and sort of reductionism of things, right? And so for major code changes, I think there are more complex code workflows that do work, these Ralph loops and discovery. And I think those are really useful to tie into and experiment with. But I try to keep reminding myself that things don't have to be complicated to be in service of our clients. And that the simpler you can make that work, the simpler it is to understand if it's working or not.
Nice. Rick?
Yeah, excuse me. My leading indicator is whether a human can explain what the AI produced without referring back to the AI. So if an engineer can look at a specification, a plan, or some generated code and articulate why it's correct, not just that it looks right, but why, then the harness is working. And if they can't, then the harness is generating plausible artifacts that nobody actually understands. And then you've traded one kind of technical debt for an even worse kind, for comprehension debt. The old kind of tech debt meant that the code was messy, but somebody understood it. Comprehension debt means the code looks clean, but nobody can explain it. And I've seen both on my current engagement. The second one is a lot harder to detect and harder to recover from.
Dave?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do you know your harness is working? And I think it's top of mind for a lot of people who are leaning into exploring what a harness is. For me, I think of it in a few dimensions. Is it working for me or is it working for my team? Because continually, I think we're trying to push towards workflows that work for teams, especially as consultants who are embedding with teams to try to help them level up on AI workflows. And then the sort of leading indicator that I'm pointing towards, is it working towards the goal or the outcome that the team or myself are oriented towards? So when it is working for me or the team, the leading indicator for me is, can I shorten the time for planning? Can I use the grill me skill that got mentioned a few times? And that's a good leading indicator for me because it does shorten the time that it takes to get a plan done. And I don't know how many folks have a heritage of the endless agile planning ceremonies or scrum planning ceremonies that would take multiple days. That was my experience in a lot of projects. And so now I use something like this grill me skill, structured planning, either as an individual, which I do frequently, and increasingly with a team. And you can get a ton of leverage out of a plan in about 30 to 40 minutes. And so the reason I think it's a good leading indicator is because just because you have a good plan doesn't mean that you'll get the outcome that you want, but there is still incredible value in compressing the amount of time it takes to get to the point where you feel like you have a confident plan. And that leads to people feeling more like they are aligned, especially if you do this collaboratively, which is a really fun experience if you haven't done it. People feel more confident in the plan. And then we have that artifact that we can either execute against as humans in the loop, or we can plug an agent in to see how effective that plan was at getting the agent to work autonomously.
Nice. Thank you. All of this is still, in a way, new to everyone on this call, right? We're all learning. And sometimes it helps to talk through a problem with someone else who gets it. So for everyone attending, if you ever hit a blocker, and this is not like a limited time offer or anything, like this is a no strings attached offer, we do office hours. It's a one-on-one personal session. You can request it. You just let us know what you want to talk about, and we'll pair you up with the person who knows a lot about that. I'll drop a link in the chat. Just save it. If something ever comes up, please do reach out because we're here to help. So we're going to talk about learning. One of the things that we value at Testable, in fact, it is one of our values, is always improving. So let's talk about ways that you're learning as you try different approaches using AI constraints and workflows. And we'll start with Jed.
Yeah, so I think the constraint I'm going to identify as being removed is tribal knowledge. This has been referred to a little bit previously, but one of the values of doing some of the planning and research and external thinking is that it forces us into doing something that we don't typically do, at least most of us as engineers, very well on our own. And I think as I've worked with AI and built AI embedded in products and using it to build code, one of the things that kind of keeps coming back to me is that most of the stuff that I lean into first in these projects are things I've historically had to lean into during organizational scale when all of a sudden I'm not the only lead engineer that is available to do a pull request review or to give architectural guidance or to share something about the project. One of the things that I think is useful to remove as a constraint is tribal knowledge by making these other sorts of processes visible. ADRs, change logs, structured logging, distributed tracing, these kinds of things. We have recently, internal as Testable, shared a talk where Martin Fowler was a guest, and he said this, that the Venn diagram of developer experience and agent experience is a circle, which I think is pretty apt, right? So by building for agents, we're also building for ourselves and vice versa. And these agents are just forcing function in my mind for investing in these processes that are shared by many high functioning engineering teams. But instead of it being a response to cultural pain of organizational growth, it's a natural outgrowth of producing these agents early where you need to have this external communication and intent and planning, research, and documentation.
Nice. Dave?
Yeah, I love this question because I think it reflects what everyone is dealing with. We're trying to automate a whole bunch of things, and then we're trying to feel pressure to push towards agentic systems, and then we have to have constraints. And then there's like this negotiation that happens. You have to remove them. You have to understand why the constraint mattered when it was missing. Maybe it's the wrong one. So a lot of the way I've been talking about this internally at Test Double is just the idea of making intent observable. Jed was mentioning, I have this like working banner term that I've used. It's called organizational observability. I've got a blog post coming soon that kind of details what that means and the impact of an organization that is not observable, both to humans and to agents. So you can look for that coming soon. But I've found that teams struggle to get important knowledge out of people's heads and into some kind of system. And you have a few people who hold all of the context in an organization. Those people become the routing layer for decisions, for documentation, and all of that institutional memory. So then you layer on, you have an AI which can synthesize and really easily make that context visible, or even just find ways to explore it. But that does have a side effect that I'm not sure we're reckoning with as well, which is, okay, if we give everyone all the information, humans and agents, is that information overload? I think the answer that many of us are experiencing is yes, it's context overload. It gives everyone the same access to information that was previously trapped in people's heads. And so I'm also a lot more convinced that the workflows that you have should increase understanding. And if they're not, then it might just be you're ticking the box on becoming, air quotes, agentic, or you're treating surfacing context and making it visible to humans and agents as an output instead of an outcome. And so if those workflows end up detaching engineers from how the system works, even in spite of surfacing all of that information, then that is a problem. And I really want humans to be in the loop, but more than that, I want humans to be in the lead with these things. I thought this would also be a good time to dovetail in, maybe tackle Dan Sharp's question on constraints. And you asked, Dan, how have or our thinking evolved about constraints in the last 3 months? I have found of late that the more constraints I add with the purposes of creating a one-size-fits-all autonomous agent, the worse off the agent becomes. And so for me, I'm starting to come to the conclusion that deriving constraints as a side effect of what I do retroactively is a much better way to try to build the types of constraints for different types of tasks. You can take a stab at this using something like the /insights command in Claude, which if you have not run, will generate you a report that shows you how well you are doing at leveraging Claude and where you might benefit from some constraints or removing some constraints. So yeah, that's something that I've found valuable as I've used Claude.
Nice. Rick?
Yeah. Don't extract. So that reminds me of Dave. And so on my current engagement, I watched what happens when a team builds a context refinement pipeline without the constraint of bottom-up validation. So the pipeline produced artifacts at every stage, and every artifact looked complete, but nobody could tell that anything was missing from inside the pipeline. So the constraint that was missing is really simple, just building something from the initial input from first principles, and then seeing if you had what you needed, if the result was what you expected. And when I did that, when I tried to really understand it, the gaps that were invisible from inside the pipeline became obvious. And so the lesson that I took from that was that plausibility is not the same as completeness. And sometimes the only way to tell the difference is to close the loop by building, by actually understanding it.
Nice. Thank you. So we're going to share round robin around what's something new that you're trying out or building for agentic coding right now. So we'll start with River.
So I've got two things really. One, actually, both of them have already been mentioned, but specifically, I've got my implementation of a Ralph loop. If you're not familiar with that idea, it's basically taking the Ralph Wiggum character from The Simpsons and making that your actual developer. Just a ridiculously simple while loop in a bash script. While I have work to do, go do the work. It starts with literally being that simple. Just put in a prompt and have it go do your work inside of that while loop. But I've, over time, created a very sophisticated workflow around my Ralph loop. Sophisticated in that I've got my actual workflow built into my workflow definition for the Ralph loop. The Ralph loop itself is still just a while loop. I happen to have wrapped it around inside of a nice terminal UI app using Golang as the way that I'm building it out. And it's very visually appealing. I can get information out of it really easily. But at the core, it's still just that simple. While I have work to do, go do the work. It starts that simple and you can just expand from there almost infinitely. The other thing is the list of personas that I've been building out recently. And I mentioned earlier a number of different personas that I've created inside of my R&D plugin that I use daily. And my favorite one out of those, between the project manager and the security engineer and the system architect and everything else, my favorite one of them is the junior developer that I built into this. And the entire purpose of the junior developer agent is to ask, what does that mean? I don't understand this. Explain it. Is this really a thing that we're doing? It just constantly pushes back with lack of understanding. And having that persona in the conversation with all of these other agents is incredibly powerful, because it forces the rest of the agents in these planning processes to actually define what we're dealing with and to really think about the details and not just this big plausible thing like Rick was talking about. I think I also have a bit of a unique circumstance amongst us panelists here, in that I'm currently deployed to a client with only one other developer, myself and another test level person. It's just us building an entire system from scratch. So a lot of the tooling that I'm building is meant to really augment us as individuals, because we don't have a larger team to actually work with and bounce ideas off of and get into those collaborative sessions. So when it really comes down to it, both my Ralph loop, which I call Power Ralph 9000, and my list of personas that I've built as custom agents, both of those are really focused on making me into a full team by using the AI as a way to actually implement all of it.
Nice. Jen?
It's a great point, Trevor, and something I think is useful to reiterate, which is that the right kind of harnesses and the right kind of agentic flows are really dependent on your team structure, what works for the team. All these sort of first principles of Toyota manufacturing still apply. If you are creating more code than you can review, then it just piles up as WIP in your backlog. So you need to target your organizational goals with the kinds of processes that you add. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for sure. The consensus out there seems to be maybe that software has never been easier, or maybe even dead. But I think actually the engineering part is harder than it's ever been before. And I think one of the hardest things to answer, I'm focused on right now, is what keeps engineers engineering. It's been a mainstay of our profession that we're outcome and customer focused. And to answer the who, why, what, the software problem. And agentic code has only amplified these sort of these foci. And the consequence of that is it's a bit of an identity crisis for many of us as engineers that feel the how is being outsourced. We hear a lot from engineering folks feel like they're very detached from the code base of the prompt, or the specification engineering feels very outcome oriented, and they're far detracted or detached from the code base, hard to answer questions. A lot back to what Rick was saying about trying to intentionally build these feedback loops into knowledge and understanding for our context. But we definitely hear that a lot. And I want our engineers to be deeply aware the systems are working in. And so and I also want data that tells me that the systems are working as I've instructed them to be designed. So in that vein, I was working with tooling that bridges the sort of traditional software development loop with observability practice. And I want to see a future where this Red-Green-Refactor workflow that we have in TDD is augmented with progressive disclosure of investigation that can create more of a curiosity, visibility, and understanding loop within our development process.
Nice. Dave?
Yeah, I'll answer this one. I think you asked, what am I building or learning? And I'll talk a little bit about things that I'm building, things that I'm learning, and maybe like some things that I'm thinking. What I'm using right now, I'm experimenting using Pi. You can check it out. It's a harness that powers OpenClaw, and it's open source. You can use it. You can go to pi.dev and check it out. Like Kathy said, it's become very popular. It's extensible, and I'm seeing people use it all over the place. I'm using it for more than just coding. I'm doing planning with the Grill Me skill. I'm doing coding. I'm doing documentation and some design adjacent stuff with it, connecting it to some design tools, pencil.dev and I think paper.design. The reason I opted for Pi is because the question that I'm testing internally, and this is like something that I'm learning, is how little stage gating, how little permission gating can I get away with if my planning is really strong and if I stay meaningfully in the loop. Pi supports that flow. It's very simple. It removes all the permission gates that you see in Claude Code, and some people bristle at that, but it's proven highly effective at moving faster and helping me understand and exposing the gaps in my planning. So it does two things really well. It removes incidental friction that you have where you get death by 1,000 cuts hitting, yes, I want you to run rip grep, or yes, I want you to run a git command for me, or I want you to read a file, Claude. So I've swung to the opposite end because I want to see the extreme. And I talked a little bit about this in the blog post that was linked, the quality you can't generate. AI is only as good as its constraints. And there's this idea that the most effective way to learn something is to oscillate between two different extremes. And then you end up navigating back and forth to get to the ideal state. So me exploring Pi is that way. I'm like, I've been down the path with Claude. I've tried all of the stage gating and the permission friction, and that's useful, but I want to see the other end of the extreme. And it's acting as a forcing function to say, is my planning good enough? Is my intent good enough? Have I communicated that? And so for me, if I remove all those friction pieces, then it really exposes where my planning is not good a lot faster than I found with Claude.
Nice. EJ?
Yeah, I've been building and experimenting with a plugin that uses Claude agent teams to orchestrate long-running workflows. This is very similar to River's Ralph loop, but just a kind of a different implementation. So Claude agent teams works by starting up multiple simultaneous Claude instances that are allowed to communicate with one another. So you have the team lead, who is in charge of, in the plugin that I'm experimenting with, managing where we are in the workflow and what the state of that is, but it otherwise makes no decisions. And each team member is responsible for each individual step of the workflow. Like the RPI workflow worked before, it might be team member 1, you're responsible for researching. The research comes back, it's saved as a markdown file. Team member 2 is then started with a completely fresh context window. And the only way that context is passed is by sharing the link to that file. And that's really nice. And I like that because we all have limited context windows. By default, it's 200,000. Other versions of Claude models have 1 million. And there's this kind of like a sweet spot of about like 50% usage for like agent output and the quality of the output for it. I have been having lots of fun with that. Another thing that I've been experimenting with is that the after session hook that I mentioned earlier to gather the knowledge base. And how I've been using that recently is I had an on-call shift, and being able to hook Claude skills up to your team's ADRs, like Judd talked about this earlier, hooking it up to your team's documentation, your ADRs, your various things on, let's say, of class, and you have specific ways that you want your class to be used with other teams in your organization. You can all add that in. So if another team comes to you with a question, how do I do this? Claude just can go and find all that documentation. If there's a production issue, you can say, hey, Claude, there is an issue here. We're seeing this error message. Please search the documentation for why this might be happening. So it has knowledge of how to go and find that information because you've built that already up locally and you've told it how to find that. I've been just experimenting with that in the last week. I found it very effective for on-call work and handling those like time-sensitive production issues.
Very nice. Rick?
The thing I'm actively experimenting with is the continuous learning cycle, making the harness itself, the system as a whole, get smarter over time. So when I encounter a problem, I don't just fix it. I have the AI remember how we diagnosed it and what the fix was, so the same class of mistake doesn't happen again. It sorts in memory for the current session, and then it gets encoded into skills that I use locally, and then into skills or other artifacts that I share with the team. So each layer widens the circle of who benefits. The experiment is seeing how far this compounds. whether a team that systematically captures and shares what it learns can stay ahead of the context diffusion problems instead of constantly rediscovering those same gaps.
Very nice. So if your team, folks who are attending, is hitting challenges on getting traction with any tools or workflows, or figuring out where to focus AI work, or proving out to other functional areas, sometimes that is a thing, where you should focus the AI work first, that is an area we can help. So I'll share a link and you can learn more there. We're going to do a kind of lightning round closing thought, and then we'll cover questions. So feel free to go ahead. If you've got a question you want to ask, navigate to the Q&A. It may be under your More menu. And go ahead and pop in a question, and we'll do some closing thoughts, and then we'll go to questions. So first, Rick.
Yeah. So what I'm most excited about is the convergence between what makes AI effective and what makes humans effective. Jed's point about the developer experience and agent experience being a Venn diagram, just a circle. What I keep coming back to is that the practices that we're developing to constrain AI, capturing context, making intent explicit, encoding judgment, are the same practices that make us better engineers and better thinkers. So we're not just building harnesses for AI, we're building cognitive infrastructure for ourselves. And the leverage isn't just that AI writes the code faster, is that the discipline of working with AI forces us to externalize knowledge that we used to just keep in our heads. And once it's externalized, it compounds. So that's what I'm excited to have more time for, not just shipping more, but understanding more.
Thank you, Rick. Jed?
Kathy, thanks. Yeah, what I'm more excited to have more time for. I think Rick hit it right on the head. I think that the concept of having a cognitive experience that matches your personal sort of neuro experience and being able to figure out how to work effectively with AI, given how you like to work and think about the world, is an incredibly freeing experience. And I think that for me personally, that translates into having more opportunity to work on the things I really want to work on that might exist somewhere outside of the common work cycle. I can pick things up and drop them, come back to the working directory. Hey, where was I? Jump right back in and not lose that context and not lose the momentum, even if it's been a week or so since I've touched some particular piece of it. I can throw it into a Ralph loop and go off on a bike ride or go to lunch or something, and then come back and be able to see the results of something. And even if it's not perfect, it has freed me up to do other things in the meantime that allow me to work at my best cognitive level across the majority of the day and keep my energy levels high.
Thank you. Dave?
Yes, what I'm most excited about is the amount of time I get to spend on polish, specifically because I come from a design background first and then I moved into engineering. I tend to think of always wanting to focus on those polishy things. And it started in design with UX, interaction design, animations, visual look and feel, brand adherence. And then as I moved into becoming an engineer, it was the abstractions, the boundaries, the elegance in the system, aesthetics. And I think AI is really like a force multiplier. And so the leverage we get from it saves us some time and it frees us up to think about the things that we enjoy. So yeah, polish is that thing. It's good at helping me. AI specifically is good at helping me get the broad strokes in place quickly, the large building blocks, the rough implementation, the first pass at the structure. And that's the stuff that I usually got sidetracked on in the past. So being freed up there gives me a lot more time to focus on those things that give me joy, refining the architecture, tightening the boundaries, improving the elegance of how the system evolves over time. And I mentioned it earlier, but I actually think aesthetics matter a lot, whether you're doing engineering and looking at the aesthetics of the code or looking at aesthetics of design. So even if you're only writing code that's going to be eventually viewed by an agent, or if it's an agent writing the code that might not be viewed by a human very often, those aesthetics matter a whole bunch in system design on the product side. product thinking. And so using AI means that I can spend more time on UI, UX, interaction design, all of that stuff, the overall feel of the experience, whether it's code or design.
Very nice. River, what are you excited about having more time for?
A big plus one to what everybody else has already said. It might sound a little bit cliche, but honestly, I'm excited to be able to do more of everything. I've always been very much a generalist with a broad skill set. I've really focused my career in the engineering side of things, creating elegant workflows and frameworks that just simplify things. That's always been my goal. And I'm finding with AI, some of that is definitely changing, but in the process of changing what I do on a daily basis, I'm able to do more of what I actually want to do. And it just explodes everywhere. I have ADHD pretty badly at that. And my brain thinks in random little jumps all over the place. And before I was using agentic coding planning tools, I had to really focus myself down. I had to drop whatever I was trying to think about and just get back to the thing that I was supposed to be working on right now. Now, if I have an idea in the middle of working on project A and that idea is for project B, I can just jump over into an AI tool for project B and say, oh, this, and then go back over to A. And I don't have to worry about it anymore. I know that the tooling has captured it, has put it into documentation somewhere, has created an issue for it, has done something with it. And with my Ralph loops for implementation specifically, I can set up a day worth of actual coding effort and I can kick it off in the background. Sometimes I'll have 2, 3, even 4 different Ralph loops running in the background while I'm doing something else. I'll have project planning going on. I'll have a conversation in Slack that I need to pay attention to and provide information into. I'll have some other thing going on and I can get to it immediately. I don't feel like I have to just constrain myself and pare myself down. And being able to do that, being able to work at the speed of my ADHD really gets me close to working at the speed of thought. And it's been incredibly freeing for me and allows me to just go everywhere and do everything all at once.
That's super awesome. Rick had to drop for a client call. If anyone has to drop, feel free. We're still recording. We'll record the Q&A and we'll share that out after. So AJ, what are you excited to have time for?
Yeah, I don't know if I have more time. It's funny how the work expands to fit the time. But if I answer the question slightly differently, I feel like I can choose where I spend my time now. I think it gives me a little bit more flexibility. And so I can focus on things that bring me more joy. So similar to the themes that Dave and River have talked about, I'll share a specific example. In our work, tasks can come from multiple sources, be it Jira, maybe an open pull request if someone's waiting on a review. Maybe there's a question in Slack. So I've been able to write a custom skill that says it uses the MCP tools that I have installed. Go look at all these sources. And then I said, here is how you prioritize the tasks in each one of these sources that pointed you towards. And just give me the one that needs my attention next. And that just saves me from all sorts of trying to figure out what needs my attention right now, which can be draining if you're just in a constant loop in that all day. And I've just found working with that to be very flexible because I can say, hey, I don't feel like working on a sidekick problem right now. So then it just finds me the next non-sidekick issue. And yeah, so that has just been, this reduces that administrative burden of finding the work to do so I can focus on the work. So that is how I enjoy spending my time.
That's awesome. AJ's also been helping me with creating a custom Claude plugin. So he's being a little modest. He's using some of that time to help others, which is super beneficial to everyone. Appreciate it. So we'll go to Q&A. So we've got a question from Aparna and wondered if Dave, first you and then River can share. So Aparna's question was, Thoughts on leveraging Claude SDK as a harness, versus building custom harness or orchestrator. If my use case is to maintain the session data, be able to replay and retrieve chat session details if resuming after a day or two.
Yeah, it's a great question. I added a link to a repo that Justin Searles has been working on, Testable co-founder. It's called Prove It. It's a really good harness. It's got a pretty robust and simple provenance model. It uses another library from Justin called Turbo Commit under the hood, which basically takes everything relevant to context from a given prompt session for a commit, jams it into the full commit message when the agent commits. And it has some really good guardrails that Justin's built to help keep agents on task and prevent them running and doing things that Justin does not want them to do. And it turns out Justin's a pretty good judge of what agents should be doing. He's had a lot of history building quality software systems. So yeah, check it out. Prove It. There's a link there that I think Kathy just shared as well.
Yeah, thank you. And then River, a note of caution.
Yeah, word of caution with using the Claude Agent SDK. You will be required to use the Anthropic API key for that, which means you cannot use your Claude subscription with it. So if cost is a concern, looking to alternatives to the SDK, my Rouse loop that I've mentioned as an example, I automated entirely with Claude-P on the command line through the CLI interface. Doing that allows me to continue using my Claude subscription to run these loops. I don't have to worry about per request API pricing. So that is definitely a concern you want to be aware of.
That's a super nice workaround. Thank you for that. Duncan had a question. Have you used AI during collaboration with other people on your team? I feel like sometimes going to AI before talking to someone can be faster or easier, but how do you describe the routes you've taken to get to an answer when you've been going back and forth with an agent? When pairing, do you also loop in an agent? So Jed's got a response for this.
Yeah, I think this sort of reminds me of the era of the Wagon by days where I would be working with a senior developer, one of my mentors, and they had these amazing Vim plugins, and they would do some sort of macro and it would run the test in another file and then go back to the implementation code or something. And whoa, how did you do that? And so there is this sort of like mind-blowing experience where when you see someone do something that you didn't expect, it leaves a mark and it leaves in a desire to want to try to figure out how to do that for yourself and maybe make it better. And so I think none of this changes when we go to an agentic flow and so I think mobbing and I think pair programming still has a pretty critical role, not just in socially and keeping the team together, but also in terms of problem solving and sharing ideas and pushing yourselves forward. So I would encourage people to continue to do it and work in the open. One of the things you can do to address the question about like, how do you describe the steps? You can actually oftentimes what I'll do, and I've used in the past, is to actually have a GitHub issue or a GitLab snippet or something that I push the process to, and I keep a documented log of the process that I work through. And then you have something to go back to that's fairly durable. You can link it in a pull request, or you can use it as a way to update a Jira issue or something like that if you're requested to cite your work, so to speak.
Nice. River?
To basically just yes and what Jed just said. One of the things that I've done with my planning skills that I've been working on is have them produce secondary artifacts of how and why every decision was made. So I'm not just bringing a document to my other coworker or to the client himself. I can point back to the history of here's the questions that were asked. Here's the decisions that were made. This is how we arrived there. So having your agentic tooling capture those secondary artifacts becomes incredibly important in showing us how we got somewhere.
Very nice. So the next question is from Mike Pack. Working individually with agents, Claude Code, Guesthound, has matured a lot in the last 12 months. Boy, has it. But coordinating shared agents across multiple engineers still seems nascent. Totally agree. What are you finding works when you need a team of engineers working on a shared agentic surface to co-develop a plan for the agents, monitor progress on tasks, or coordinate handoff between specialized agents? Who wants to take that one?
I guess I'll just point back to what I just said. I honestly don't have a ton of experience around that right now because I'm working with one other person. But I believe that the artifacts you create out of your tooling are going to be an incredibly important part of that. Hopefully, maybe Jed or AJ has some more detailed answer along those lines.
AJ.
Yeah, I will jump on the handoff part of the question. I think that's how I would tackle that. I also don't have experience with the fire and forget, like shared agents among teams. We have agents, but it is still part of a interactive session. But I think having an agent create a handoff document at the end describing what it worked on and what it needs to do next that's been a successful pattern that I've seen and that I've used. I prefer that to trying to compact context, for example. If I'm about out of my context, I will ask for a handoff document and then I will just create a new session with that document, just so I know exactly what it is keeping in context and what it's throwing away. Let me just reread the question real quick, see if there's anything else I can answer. What are you finding? Agents. For co-developing a plan, I'm going to answer that as if it's like the acceptance criteria. I think that is part of just a normal or a regular like planning session of agreeing what the definition of done is. So specifying your acceptance criteria, making it very specific, calling out of scope, just things you'd normally do, even outside of working with AI. Yeah, that's the best I can answer.
Thank you.
That's a tough question. Yeah.
Next question is from Anurag Sharma. Do you still see software engineering jobs still being relevant after 10 years or in the future after maybe AGI? If no, what pivot would you suggest? This is a tough one. What can software engineers be prepared for? Jed. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll take that. I don't know that I can have any kind of crystal ball, just like anybody else. What I anticipate, this has come up in many times in many conversations that I've had with my colleagues and other people. And what I can say is that in some ways, people that are very new to prompt engineering and agentic building products with very little engineering background, they're at the top of what they call Mount Idiot in some respects. Like what's the name of the complex where you have the big trough and then the
hype cycle?
The hype cycle, Rick. Actually, no, it's actually more of you don't know what you don't know. And I do things every day, 100 times a day, where I'm like, if I didn't know how to do this at the very basic first principles level, I would be so lost right now. I'd be having to go back to Quad and asking it how to do this, and it would be this constant loop and cycle. Yes, the Dunning-Kruger, I couldn't think of it. Exactly. So we're at the top of Mount Idiot here in the Dunning-Kruger thing, and then you eventually get to the bottom of the cycle where you're like, I have no idea how much I don't know. And that's actually when you start to become an expert, right? So I think that there is this immediate hype where it's like, hey, everybody can do this. But the reality of that is that this is, in some respects, in particularly certain industries, dangerous stuff in some respects. But a lot of software, they're saying that is a lot of software doesn't necessarily have to meet the criteria of a banking application. And so I think there starts to become a deviation in roles and responsibilities of what things you might work on in 10 years that are very software oriented and things that you probably won't because there's not necessarily a market for it. I've been thinking about this idea of we used to have this idea of a T-shaped developer where you were very broad across the top in many different places and you had a very narrow specialty in the middle somewhere. Maybe it was database, maybe it was backend, maybe it was front-end code. And that kind of narrowest piece is where you went really deep and you understood it very well. I think now we might be more like an N or M-shaped developer sort of thing, where you might need to have a couple of very deep specifications, and they might be on the very edges of the stack. So historically, most of those T's kind of are in the middle because you could like use React and do most things on the front end. Even if you weren't a super great front end developer, you could use an ORM to use to interface to the database, even if you weren't a database administrator. But I think now with agentic coding, it makes more sense to be really focused on the core systems and not necessarily the interstitial framework language places where you're trying to bridge the difference between not being able to know the depth in these very core first principle pieces of technology. So I think software engineering looks a lot different in 10 years because I think it can be very specialized. And I think that unfortunately, people that have been doing it for 10 years are at a power law advantage when it comes to AI because we've built a lot of skills. But it's very possible too that the way that we build favors newer people who pick up and learn those skills, just as was the case at the turn of the century in the .com boom. So I think we'll have and I also think the other prediction I'll make is software problems become smaller and you sell to smaller markets. So we tend to I think we might be more of like in a cottage industry software piece where maybe you don't need to go get funding if you can find something specialized enough that you can sell at a higher price to a smaller group of people that you can serve as with a 1 or 2 development engineering team.
River's got the next question from Dan Sharp. What does mobbing with AI look like? Someone prompting, the rest watching, human chat until agreement, someone types dictates. So River?
I think there's really 2 answers to that question, and it depends on your context. But a lot of what Dave Mosher talked about previously was using the grill me skill. And I know in his case, he would be having a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting or however they gather everyone together, where there would be conversation amongst all the team members, and Dave would be consolidating, synthesizing, typing answers, and putting more information into that skill. And once you've got that, then you can distribute the artifacts and move on. From my perspective, though, a lot of what I've been doing with the personas that I've created as custom agents is building AI mobbing. So I'm one developer working on this project, but I need a UX specialist. I need a security specialist. I need that junior developer to ask, what does that actually mean? Where did this come from? So I put together my planning skills and my plan breakdown skills specifically with AI agent mobbing. I can kick off a process. I can let each one of these specialists go through what they're best at and what they do well. And at the end of it, I have the coordinating aspect of it, whether it's a skill or the project manager agent surfacing everything that was decided so I can review it. And that really has become my version of mobbing on a particular problem. When you get down further into the implementation layers, though, it gets a little more tricky as well, because you've got to start thinking about your work being divided up into smaller pieces. You can't have a mob of AI engineers working on the same issue ticket. You got to be able to create clear boundaries between all of these issue tickets. And where in the past we may have had teams that would focus on a particular horizontal layer, you've got the database, you've got the backend, you've got the API, you've got the front end, you've got all of these different layers. I find it to be far more effective now to send agents at a vertical slice. One ticket for me should represent a complete vertical slice for getting something done. It creates some challenges in coordination across agents because I can't wait for all of a horizontal layer to be done and then stick a whole bunch of agents at the next layer. I have to divide up my work tickets in ways that the agents are actually able to complete their vertical slice. They have to be able to go through each of those different repositories, in my case, but all the different layers in that architecture to get things done. And that definitely creates challenge. But again, I think the theme that we've been coming back to over and over again is, does it work for a human team? Yes, it's probably going to work for an AI agent team as well. And that kind of really, that understanding and the ability or the need to really make all of our implicit knowledge explicit. That's where we get the mobbing capability with AI in the picture.
Thank you. And then AJ, Dan was asking about compacting and what you need to keep in mind there.
Yeah. So I will say that it is getting better. I was playing around with Opus 4.7 this weekend, and I had a super long running session that I think auto compacted on me 5 or 6 different times with a total context over all of those of at least 650,000 tokens. And it was doing good till about the last one of those compactions. But I will say what I did that I think really helped it is before I started that work, I went through a full planning session. I just put Claude in plan mode and I said, this is what I'd like to do. Came up with the big plan. And then I had it write to markdown files. So I had what my plan was, what my different specifications were, some design documents of some important things that I wanted to keep track of. So every time it compacted, it knew that it could go back and read those files. So I think those plans then got reloaded into context. It knew what the final outcome needed to be. And so that way, when it compacted, it could get rid of things that it already worked on. So I still think that's important. And I've noticed that having those hard copy versions of your plans helps compaction. But yeah, is it less of a problem? Yeah. Models are getting better. The Claude code is getting better.
Yeah. Dan shares he has one that he's nearly at 20 compactions, but it's still effective. But also noting he built some custom tooling around pre and post compaction hooks. So maybe that helps.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Next question. When breaking down work for agents, do you figure out the critical path manually or delegate that part to an orchestrator? Great question. Who wants to take that? I think that'll be our final question.
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by critical path in this case.
Whoever asked that, if you want to clarify, feel free. Pop the clarification into the Q&A or the chat.
I will answer this as if it's coming up with the plan, like critical path, meaning what needs to happen. So when I am planning, I like making the plan at such a detail that I know exactly what needs to happen in each place. So including like source code snippets. This file needs to get updated and this is the source code. So that by the time it goes to implement, it is pretty much done. Now that doesn't scale as well if you're just trying to fire and forget. So in that case, it's more about coming up with the instructions for each agent for how to make that, which I would sit down and think about that very carefully. But yeah, I think I would not delegate that part to an orchestrator. There's a fun phrase for this. I don't want to outsource my thinking, just the doing, I think is where I'd go with that. So I would want a specification for every change that I'd want it to make at least.
Nice. Don't outsource the thinking.
I wonder if potentially they're talking about maybe somebody using some like superpowers or Boris to kick off the plan though, like where you start with something fairly general as a seed prompt. So you're not necessarily outthinking the thinking piece, but you're outsourcing the research phase of like, where would I need to touch? I need to do this thing. What files would I need to touch in the current code path in order to do this? What would it look like? And then like critically reviewing that. That's a common workflow that I do in terms of starting with a very narrow and specific, but unshaped prompt, getting the research and then honing that thinking process through the iterative process. So I don't know, like I could see where you could call Ouroboros or even Superhuman brainstorming an orchestrator, right? Because it's orchestrating stuff under the hood. So there's, again, some overlap and nuance that might be lost in the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'll revise my answer. If it's about figuring out like what the research, like Jed, what you're just talking about, I absolutely ask the agent, Claude in my case, what is the current state of the code base? What do I need to change? And I just say, I would like to do this. What do you think? If I am not sure, I always make sure to unleash the agent and say, hey, if I have forgotten to ask you something, Please suggest it to me. And that I get surprised every now and then where it's like, hey, have you thought of this? And no, I haven't thought of that. Let's explore that. Please tell me everything you know about that. And then I can go and do like the web searches and everything. And that's been really helpful during the planning phases. River.
Specifically to address the work breakdown aspect of it, trying to look at this from a different perspective slightly. Building out plans in a user story format is an incredibly powerful way of looking at the critical path for one thing that we want to develop. As a whatever user, I need to something so that I can. That creates a critical path right there. I don't have a lot of user story oriented planning in my planning skills right now, but it's something that I recognize the need for because it creates that kind of critical path. Having something like that, whether it's a workflow diagram that outlines, here's the primary flows, which I have done a number of times, or a user story or something else. I think it is important for us as humans to state these are the goals that we're trying to accomplish, and this is why for every one of those goals. And once we've got all of that laid out, I think we can send the AI agents after the user story or the workflow or whatever it is that we've defined up front in order for it to understand what that critical path really is.
One more thing. Sorry, Kathy, I told you I wouldn't do this.
You're
but
fine. Final thought from AJ.
Yeah, final thought. Getting back to what we were just talking about. I think this is a old Cold War thing. Trust but verify. So I want to trust the AI, but I also want to always verify its output. I trust what it's doing. And before I put it out, I often have a second path with a fresh context saying, these are looking at the claims that were made and asking that second pass, verify every claim. Do not trust the output. Actually run the test. Show me in the logs where that happened. We mentioned Justin Searle's prove it skill. That is definitely a big part of the prove it skill, is actually verify by actually doing it. So final thought.
Very nice. So thank you everyone for joining us for coffee time. This is really cool. We'll share out a recording. You should get it in your inbox tomorrow morning. It'll have the recording plus all of these links to resources we shared. And thank you very much. You can sign up for our newsletter. There will be a link to that. And on social is where we'll share when we have our next coffee time. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.